The Battle of Ia Drang was one of the first major battles between the combined forces of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, PAVN, and the United States Army against the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. The battle consisted of two engagements. The first engagement occurred over 3 days from November 14 to November 16, 1965, at Landing Zone X-Ray at the base of the Chu Prong Mountain Range, 25 kilometers west of Ple My. The second engagement took place on November 17 at Landing Zone Albany, near the southern bank of the Ia Drang River. The name of the battle is derived from the Drang River, which flows through the valley northwest of Ple My. The Central Highlands belonged to the 2 Tactical Zone of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and was the B3 front with the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam. In September 1965, the U.S. Military Command dispatched the 1st Cavalry Division to An Key, Gia Lai, to block the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, from supporting the PLAF, cutting off the Central Highlands along with the coastal plains. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, established Special Zone 24, which included the 2 provinces of Con Tum and Gia Lai, and transferred the primary combat responsibilities in the Central Highlands to U.S. forces to implement the search and destroy mission under the strategy of the War of Attrition. To conduct the campaign, the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam dispatched 3 infantry regiments, 320, 33, 66, 1 Special Forces Battalion, 1 Artillery Battalion, and 1 12.7 mm anti-aircraft machine gun battalion, along with local armed forces to disrupt enemy communications and rear bases. Expected to be divided into 3 phases. Phase 1. Besiege the Ple My outpost and destroy the ARVN forces sent for reinforcement. Phase 2. Continue to besiege the Ple My outpost to force the U.S. forces to join the battle. The 33rd Regiment was ordered to capture the Ple My camp. Ple My held a crucial position close to Route 19B, which connects Duc Co with Pleiku Town, and Route 14, which links Phu Nan with Buon My Thuat. Upon discovering the enemy's movement, the ARVN decided to send reinforcements to Ple My. On October 23, at 12 p.m., Task Force 3 Armor from Phu My began their march to Ple My, consisting of 3 M113 Armored Cavalry Squadrons and tanks, the 21st Ranger Battalion, the 1st Battalion of the 42nd Regiment, and 2,105 mm artillery pieces. At 4:30 p.m., the lead elements of the formation entered the ambush site set by the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam. Battalions 634 and 635 charged into the middle of the formation. By 6 p.m., the battle had concluded, with the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam reporting the destruction of 59 tanks and armored vehicles, the elimination of 800 ARVN soldiers, and the capture of 2,105 mm artillery pieces, 6 ammunition vehicles, and 40 various weapons, along with shooting down 2 aircraft. On October 25, after twice breaking through ambushes, the reinforcement convoy managed to reach the Ple My camp. After the reinforcements entered the camp, Regiments 320 and 33 were ordered to withdraw. The 33rd Regiment retreated from Ple My to the Ia Drang Valley area, about 10 kilometers to the west, to set up defensive positions. The U.S. Army initiated Operation Long Reach, employing aerial bombardment in the area and preparing for search and destroy missions. On November 10, the 3rd Brigade, 1st Cavalry Division, replaced the 1st Brigade and received orders to execute a feint maneuver by shifting operations eastward. This was intended to lure the B3 Front Command to concentrate its 3 regiments into assembly areas in preparation for a second attack on Ple My camp scheduled for November 16. On November 11, according to U.S. intelligence, the positions of the 3 People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam regiments were as follows: the 320th Regiment at YA 820,070, the 33rd Regiment at YA 940011, and the 66th Regiment at YA 9104. On November 12, the 3rd Brigade, 1st Cavalry Division, received orders to advance to the base of the Chu Prong Mountain Range. On November 13, Colonel Brown met with Lieutenant Colonel Moore and ordered preparations for a landing at Landing Zone X-Ray the following morning. A battalion of the U.S. Army's Air Cavalry landed on the southern bank of the Ia Drang River. Another battalion landed at Strongpoint 732. An air cavalry brigade secured Route 19B. On November 11, a U.S. battalion continued to land at Ple Go, 12 kilometers west of Ple Me. On November 14, 1965, the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, 1/7th of the U.S. Army landed at Landing Zone X-Ray. Regarding the North Vietnamese Army, the command for the Battle of Ia Drang was stationed at the southern base of Chu Prong Mountain. Their forces included the 66th Regiment and the 1st Battalion of the 33rd Regiment, under the command of Nguyen Hu An, commander, and Dang Vu He, political commissar, coordinating with the H-15 Battalion of the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam to conduct diversionary attacks along Route 13. Facing them were 3 battalions of the U.S. Army, the 1/7th, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore, the 2/7ths of the 3rd Brigade, and the 2/5ths of the 2nd Brigade, totaling approximately over 1,000 troops. At the same time, the U.S. mobilized an artillery battalion to establish 2 artillery positions, 12 105mm guns, 2 kilometers southwest of Quen Claw and 3 kilometers southeast of Ia Drang to support the 3rd Brigade. Thus, in terms of sheer combat numbers, the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam had an advantage, 1,500 troops compared to 1,000 U.S. troops. However, the U.S. forces were heavily equipped with firepower, with an average of 1 frontline U.S. soldier being supported by 5 others in the rear with artillery fire, bombing, and medical evacuation. During the battle, U.S. artillery fired 6,000 rounds per day, and the Air Force conducted 300 sorties per day, including B-52 bombers. After establishing their positions, the U.S. Army concentrated artillery and helicopter fire on the landing zone X-ray area. At 10:48 a.m., the U.S. used 8 helicopters to deploy the lead element, Bravo Company, also known as Company B, under Captain John Herron of the 1st Battalion, 109 soldiers including the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, to landing zone X-ray. 35 minutes later, the U.S. continued to deploy Alpha Company, also known as Company A, consisting of 106 soldiers under Captain Tony Nadal. Once Company A was in position, Battalion Commander Moore split his forces into 2 prongs to attack the 9th Battalion of the 66th Regiment. The 9th Battalion was taken by surprise. The battalion commander was meeting the regimental commander to receive orders, the Chief of Staff was preparing the battlefield in Ban Mi Thuat, the deputy political officer was at the regimental headquarters, and the senior political officer was with Company 12. The highest-ranking officer present was a battalion assistant. Despite the surprise, the soldiers of the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam did not panic and organized themselves for combat. Companies 13, 11, and 12, hearing the gunfire, proactively maneuvered to flank the enemy. Company B of the U.S. forces was heavily attacked on both flanks. Faced with continuous counterattacks by the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam, both prongs of the U.S. assault were broken and forced to regroup over 1 kilometer east of the 9th Battalion to defend themselves. One U.S. platoon was surrounded at the edge of landing zone X-ray, and platoon leader Henry Herrick was killed in action. Initial efforts to relieve the surrounded platoon were unsuccessful. By around 1:30 p.m., the U.S. forces at landing zone X-ray were reinforced by Charlie Company, also known as Company C, led by Captain Bob Edwards, to strengthen the defensive capabilities against the assaults by the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam. Brigadier General Knowles, forward commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, reported to General Kinner, commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, that the 1/7th Cavalry Battalion had engaged the enemy and requested an additional battalion to reinforce against the 2 enemy battalions, the 7th and 9th. At 5 p.m., U.S. forces called for continuous artillery and airstrikes on the positions of the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam, causing the companies to withdraw from their positions. Companies 11, 12, and 15 withdrew to the northwest of Con Chua Stream, and Company 13 withdrew towards the 7th Battalion. As a result, the 9th Battalion successfully repelled the U.S. assault, with the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam reporting approximately 150 U.S. soldiers killed and 1 fighter jet shot down. Also at 5 p.m., Colonel Brown ordered the 2/5th Cavalry Battalion to be airlifted to Landing Zone Victor, 5 kilometers from Landing Zone X-Ray, to be ready to support the 1/7th Cavalry Battalion the next morning. At 7 p.m., General Kinnard discussed with General Larson, commander of the 1st Field Force, the use of B-52 bombers to strike the area around Landing Zone X-Ray. He was informed that General Dupuy, Chief of Staff at McVie, had coordinated with General Vin Locke, commander of 2nd Corps, and planned to use B-52s to bomb the area at 4 p.m. the following day. After being repelled by the 9th Battalion of the People's Liberation Armed Forces of South Vietnam, PLAF, U.S. forces regrouped into a defensive perimeter around Landing Zone, LZ, X-Ray. During the night, they used aircraft to drop flares and artillery to guard against surprise attacks. November 15, 1965. 5:30 a.m. The 7th Battalion of the 66th Regiment of the PLAF launched a surprise attack on the 1/7th Cavalry Battalion. The attacking force included Companies 1 and 2, supported by 2 82mm mortars from Company 15. The battalion deployed about 150 meters from the enemy and fired 14 mortar rounds before ordering Companies 1 and 2 to charge. The 7th Battalion soldiers used a platoon equipped with 3 B-40 rocket launchers, 6 RPD machine guns, 3 heavy machine guns, and 13 AK-47 rifles to target radio communication and engage in close combat with U.S. forces. After a few minutes of chaos, the U.S. forces responded fiercely. U.S. aircraft provided support with bombs and rockets, including napalm bombs, which hit the mixed positions of both sides. The U.S. suffered an additional 24 dead and 20 wounded. 9:30 a.m., Colonel Brown, commander of the 3rd Brigade, landed at LZ X-Ray to arrange the withdrawal of the 1/7th Cavalry Battalion. The attack on LZ X-Ray forced the PLAF to temporarily postpone their assault on the Pleme stronghold. Around 12 p.m., the 2/5th Cavalry Battalion entered the battlefield after being airlifted to LZ Victor, about 5 kilometers from LZ X-Ray, at 8 a.m., and then silently marched to LZ X-Ray to rescue the isolated platoon. By about 3 p.m., the platoon was relieved. The PLAF was unaware that the balance of forces had shifted from 2-2 to 3-2 in favor of the U.S. 4 p.m. B-52 bombers began carpet bombing the YA 8702 area, about 7 kilometers west of LZ X-Ray, and continued for the next 5 days. 4:30 p.m., Brigadier General Knowles, forward commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, landed at LZ X-Ray and announced that the 1/7th Cavalry Battalion would be withdrawn the following day. Around 5 p.m., the 1/9th Cavalry Battalion advanced into the B-52 bombed area to assess the bombing results. November 16, 1965. Morning. Lieutenant Colonel Moore received orders to evacuate the 1/7th Cavalry Battalion by helicopter, leaving the 2/7ths and 2/5ths battalions to defend the landing zone. This strategy was intended to reassure the PLAF that the balance of forces remained 2-2. 8:25 p.m. General Dupuy completed the plan for a B-52 bombing run the following noon. Colonel Brown, commander of the 1st Cavalry Brigade, assured that the cavalry units would have enough time to move out of the 3-kilometer safety radius. Casualties and outcome. The initial phase of the Battle of Ia Drang ended with the U.S. reporting 79 dead and 121 wounded. This number closely matched the PLAF's estimate of over 250 enemy soldiers killed. However, casualty figures for the Vietnamese side were more conflicting. Moore reported that the U.S. counted 634 dead Vietnamese soldiers, not including the wounded, initially estimated up to 834 but later reduced due to plausibility concerns. The historical record of the 66th Regiment noted 55 killed and about 100 wounded, 30% of the 7th Battalion's strength.